Introducing 100 Days of Code with Treehouse. What is 100 Days of Code? It's a long-standing coding challenge created by Alex Callaway, and it's simple. Commit to learning every day for 100 days. The amount that you learn in that short time frame will change your life. Whether you want to level up your skills or jumpstart a new career, commit to the challenge. You'll be shocked by how much you learn and accomplish. You'll have the full support of the Treehouse community of students working with you. We'll be sending you motivational emails, clips from our 100 Days of Code podcast, featuring advice, tips and tricks from developers, and so much more. There's never been a better time to commit to your learning. Join us.
Cool. All right. Well, hello again, everyone. As always, I'm hoping all is well out there for you. I am Guil Hernandez. I'm a software development instructor at Treehouse. That's teamtreehouse.com. And at Treehouse, I teach full-stack JavaScript development and front-end web development. And yeah, if you've been checking out all of our live streams here lately, welcome back. And thank you so much for tuning in. And you can also view all of our other live streams in our YouTube channel on the Treehouse Live playlist. Now, in my previous live stream, we started talking about creating interactivity with JavaScript and the DOM, right? We focused on a couple of things: selecting and manipulating elements in the document, and how to get around in or traverse the DOM, right? So move from one node or element to another. So today, we'll continue our JavaScript and the DOM journey. And I'm going to talk a little bit about DOM events and delegation, listening for events or user actions, and then any DOM manipulation, right, that might happen in response to a user's action. We also have our awesome Treehouse staff moderating the chat. So if you have questions about anything covered in this live stream or about Treehouse in general, feel free to ask away. Those questions will get sent my way. And I'll do my best to answer as quick as possible. So cool. Let's first do a little review of what I covered in my last live stream about modifying the DOM. So in that live stream, I talked about selecting DOM elements, right? So how to get a reference to one or multiple elements in the document, then do something to them or with them. So I covered how the DOM interface or API offers a few methods you can use to access elements on the page. Some common ones are get element by ID, get elements by class name, and so on. And below we have the more flexible ones that I recommended, which are query selector and query selector all. And they're really awesome because they let you use CSS selectors, right, to grab elements from the DOM. And I also talked about how some methods like get element by class name return what's called an HTML collection, and other methods like query selector all returns a node list. Now, a node list and an HTML collection, I talked about how they're very much the same, right? They're really similar to an array. And the difference is that a node list is more flexible, right? It can contain any node, right? An element node or a text node. An element node being like a regular HTML tag, and a text node is any content that's not wrapped in a tag, for example. And yeah, an HTML collection is like an array that can hold node elements only. And finally, we had a look at DOM traversal, right? So, and that's a way to move from one part of the DOM to another and select an element based on its relationship to another element. So it's really handy when you have a reference to one element or any type of node and you need to get a hold of another one nearby, right? You can use the properties JavaScript provides for walking and traversing the DOM. And I talked about a few of those properties, right? Some of them were parent node, parent element, first element child, next element sibling, and a couple of others. So yeah, let's continue to use some of these techniques while getting into some new stuff. So you can select elements on the page, right? You can make changes to those elements, do things with them. So now we'll get into what are called event listeners. And we're going to use them to make a site, or really a web page, respond to user actions, right? Like clicking a button, scrolling, or moving the mouse. You can respond to all those kind of events using what are called event listeners, right? To talk a little bit more about what they are, right? When you load up a web app or a web page in your browser and you start to interact with it, you're really generating all kinds of events or actions that the browser is listening for and sort of registering behind the scenes. So because of that, the browser is able to do something in response to that event via the DOM, right? So for example, you click a thumbnail of a photo, then a larger version of that photo might pop up. You can initiate an animation when the user scrolls to a specific part of the page, and so on and so on, right? Something can happen when you click into a text field or submit a form. And a user, it's possible that they can spark hundreds or even thousands of these events. Now, in most cases, the browser is not going to do anything special in response to each event, but in order to have the browser do something in response to one of these events, like a click, right? We have to write some JavaScript code that listens for that specific event, then handles and responds to it, right? In addition, each event, and we'll talk about this more in depth in just a bit, each event is represented by an object called the event object. So I am going to continue working with this simple pet directory page I created a couple of weeks ago. If you want to access the code I'm writing today or follow along, you can check out the link that's going to be posted in the chat. Cool. So when you select an element with JavaScript, right, once you have a reference to it, from there, you can either manipulate the element directly or ask it to listen for user interactions or events. So for example, there's a click event that fires off when a user clicks on something, like a button, for example. There's also a double click event, a change, mouse down, mouse up, mouse move, so many more events that you can, if you go to Mozilla Developer Network, for example, and you can check out a list of all the available or events that you can listen for. So let's do this. In the web page we're working on, let's go into our JavaScript file here, app.js, which I have comments about what we're going to do step by step. Let's first select the header and use an event listener to change the color of this paw SVG, right, the logo, when a user clicks anywhere in the header. So I'm going to go back to my app.js file here, and the first thing I'm going to do is select the header at the top. I'll assign it to variable header with document.query selector header. And down here, I'm going to type some code first, and then we'll have a closer look at it line by line, right? So I'll first do header.addEventListener, and we're going to listen for the click event. So I'll pass it the string click, followed by a callback function. And within the function, let's grab the header and do header.firstElementChild. And what are we going to do? We're going to fiddle with its style property. Let's set a property with the setProperty method. And it's an SVG, so we're going to set its fill property. And so we have this random hex function down here, and what it does, it returns a random hex value. So I'm going to call that here as the second argument. I'm going to call that function, invoke it. All right, so let's go over this code, right? So let me bump this up here. So this is header.eventListener, right? This method here, eventListener, is really a function, and it's going to wait for an event to happen, right? So here I'm attaching an event listener to the header. And now the header, as I mentioned, is going to wait and listen for any given events to fire, right? In this case, a click event, right? So we're passing it the string click because we want it to listen for a click event. And then the function that follows, this callback arrow function here, is called an event handler or a handler function. And it's a callback that's going to run when that click event fires, right? So when the click event fires, we do a little DOM traversal here to target the the SVG elements, which if I look at the HTML file here, the SVG is the first child of the header. So we're saying here we're saying header.firstElementChild, and then we're using the style. We're using style.set property to set the fill property of the logo to a random hex value. So let's have a look at it in the browser. So clicking anywhere in the header makes the Paul SVG change to a random hex color. Cool. Now you can make this code a little bit easier to read, right, by assigning header.firstElementChild to a variable. For example, within the callback here, we'll say const, let's say logo equals header.firstElementChild, and here we can call logo.style, that's that property. That's going to work in the same way. Yeah, let's do this. Maybe we can use a CSS variable here too, right? We talked about those a while back, a few live streams ago, so we can have our JavaScript interact with our CSS. So I'm going to open the style sheet here, style.css, and in this logo rule, I'll set the, since we're targeting an SVG here, I'll set this to the var function, not that gibberish. So var, and then, we're going to declare a custom property here named fill color, and then assign it this default hex value. So now over in JavaScript land, we can do set property, the name of the variable. This has nothing to do with the DOM, by the way. I just like working with CSS variables, so that's what I'm doing. So should work the same way, and it does. Cool. It's a little more flexible now. Cool. So so that works, but now how can we add this event listening behavior we just looked at to multiple elements on the page, right? So one way we might do that is by looping through all the returned elements or nodes and then call add event listener on each of them, right? So for example, in the HTML file, so this is a unordered list with a class pet list and has a bunch of list items and which displays these boxes here. So notice how each of these list items contains a checkbox. Now, we could attach an event listener to each of these checkboxes to make something happen upon checking the box. Like, for example, let's change the border color of a pet item when a checkbox gets checked. So back in app.js, again up top, what are we going to do? Well, I'll target all the checkboxes and assign them to the variable checkboxes. For that, I'll use document.querySelectorAll, and that's going to return a node list, right? So let me pass it. Let's do input type checkbox. And that looks good. So as I mentioned, this is going to return a node list, right? A collection, an array-like collection of those checkbox nodes. So I can't just, call event listener, add event listener directly on checkboxes. What I need to do is iterate over each node and attach an event listener to it. So again, right here, I'll type a little bit of code, and then we'll talk about it. All right, so let's do checkboxes. I'm using the for each iteration method here. So we'll say checkbox, callback, and for each checkbox, we'll add an event listener. What event do we want to listen for? Well, change is one event for input types. And let's do the callback here. And then we'll say checkbox.parent node. We're going to talk about all of this in just a bit. Class list dot toggle selected. And selected is a class that's already been defined in the CSS, which applies a border, a green border around an element. All right, so let's go over this code real quick. Make sure it's all lining up and saying what I want to say. Okay, so cool. So we're listening here. We're listening for the change event, right? And the change event, as I mentioned, is used for when the state of a checkbox changes, right, from checked to unchecked, for example. And then we're doing a little DOM traversal to access the parent node of the checkbox, which is really the li, as I mentioned here. And then we're using the toggle method, right? So first of all, let me backtrack a little bit. The class list property that you see here that we're calling on it, that provides an easy way to access an element's list of classes, right? So whatever appears in its class attribute, for example. So class list.toggle is going to do just that, right? It's going to kind of create a toggler of sorts. It's going to remove a class from the list if it already exists, or add it to the class list if it does not exist. So let's see that in action. So if I check a box, it turns its parent list item to green. Cool. Yeah, so again, checkbox.parent node, what it's doing is it's saying, hey, I'm targeting the checkbox, but let's go up and target its parent node, which is the list item. So that's why if you look at it in Chrome DevTools here, you'll see that it's the list item that's being applied that class. So let's target the first one, and there it is selected. Good. Cool. All right, now each event listener, there's more we can do here. Each event listener gets something passed through it as a parameter, and it's called the event object. And it's usually written as event or just the letter E. As you can see here, I'm passing it through as a parameter. And this event object has some really useful information about the event, and it offers a few methods that we can use to help us handle the event inside the handler. So the property you'll probably use most often is target, and that's a reference to the element that's receiving the event, right? In other words, the element that's changing in this case. So if I, for example, let's say I click on the first, checkbox, the first element checkbox. Well, event.target would contain a reference to this checkbox only, not the other ones. So instead of instead of saying checkbox.parent node, I can pass the event object, as I'm doing here, via the parameter E, and then I can say e.target.classlist.toggle, and it works in the same way. Or it doesn't. Let's see. Oh, right. So we need to get its parent node. So e.target, as I mentioned, is the checkbox, but we still need its parent node, which is the list item. Might sound a little wonky, but if you have, I encourage you to open up the project files that I provided a link for, so you can get a feel for how traversal works, right, with these properties. So there we go. Now, with this event object comes a few additional advantages, right? So namely, it lets you take advantage of a technique called event delegation or event bubbling. And, an event, let me bring up the slide for that. So an event received by an element, right, like the click event or change events we just looked like, it doesn't stop with that one event, right? That event continues to move on up to other elements like the parent and any other ancestors of that target element. So event delegation is a technique that lets you place one event listener on a parent or ancestor that can then delegate an event and handler functions to its nested element. In doing so, we can write more powerful and efficient handlers and optimized code. So let's bring back the code we just wrote. And what's currently happening here is that we're having to loop through this node list, right, and attach an event listener to every single checkbox in the list. Now, I imagine if there was like 100 or 200 checkboxes, that's a lot of event listeners to be attaching to elements, right? So with event delegation, we can replace all those individual handlers and that we're attaching to each checkbox with just a single event listener that kind of sits up over them as a parent in a parent element and starts like delegating these events and actions out, right? So that way, we apply it in one place, and the event sort of gets bubbled up and captured up in the parent or ancestor. So let's have a look at that. Let me comment out this for each method here. And so we're going to put an event listener on this parent UL. So up top, let me target the UL on the page with the class pet list. So I'll assign it to the constant pet list, and we'll do document dot query selector and the class pet dash list. And then down here, I'm going to put an event listener, attach an event listener to pet list. So I'll write out some code here, and then we'll talk about it. So we'll do pet list dot add event listener, change, pass in the event object as a parameter, and then in here, we'll assign the target variable, the target, and let me write this conditional here, and we'll talk about it more in depth. So as a condition, we'll say if target dot tag name strictly equals input. We're going to do something. Target again, this selected class I'm using here, it's already been defined in the CSS, as I mentioned. Okay, so getting back to our code. So here, we're getting, so we know that we're attaching an event listener to the target UL, and we're listening for a change event because we're listening for when a checkbox changes, right? So what we're doing here with this target variable, we're getting the specific element that's triggering the event, right? The checkbox in this case, and assigning it to the variable target. Now, this if statement here is going to run this code for the input elements only, right? The checkboxes. So it's using the tag name property provided by JavaScript to get the element's tag name, right? So if the target's tag name is input, then, we're going to target its parent node and toggle its class list. So it works in the same way, just a little bit more optimized. So let's check it out. Yep, there we go. So yeah, this is going to make, I'm applying the event listener on an ancestor, and all the events get caught up here. And it's also, what happens is when you attach it just to one node, it's going to use less of the browser's memory, right, for all those individual listeners, if we had done it this way, as I showed you prior to this. Cool. This, you might also hear this called event bubbling, right? Because what the event is doing, it's really bubbling up, right? It rises up like bubbles up the DOM tree, and that's kind of where the term came from. And the really interesting thing and advantageous thing about event delegation is that if we add more and more list items and checkboxes, even after the event listener has run, it's still going to work for those. Cool. So let's do a couple more things. So each list item, as you can see, contains a pet image, and it's currently hidden with CSS. In fact, if I go here and do comment out this display none, you can see all the images really quick. So let's show and hide each pet image, right? When a user clicks on a pet item, kind of like a toggler of sorts again, right? Now, since there are multiple list items, we'll again use event delegation and a little DOM traversal for this as well. So uncomment that. So here, let me write the code for this, and then we'll walk through it line by line. So I'm going to put the event listener on the parent node. In this case, it's, once again, the pet list. So we'll say pet list.add event listener. This time we're listening for a click event, right? So when a user clicks on the list item, let's pass in the event object. Let's do a couple things here. We'll assign target event.target. It's a little more consistent. So we'll do target.event.target and talk a little bit more about what this variable means in just a second as well. All right, now here comes the conditional, just like last time. If, since we're doing some event delegation here, in the event listener, we'll say if the tag name of the target is a list item, right? So li, we have to write it capitalized in most cases. So we're going to do pet image, and we're going to, once again, class list toggle this show property, right? Or rather, class. So this class show, again, it's written in the CSS. It's really just shows, it's displayed to block. The image is by default displayed to none, so it's going to toggle between that block and none state. All right, so this time, the if statement will run only for list items, right? So then upon clicking an li, class list.toggle is going to add or remove the show class. Now, what is this here? constpet.image. Well, so when we click inside a list item here, it's going to look for the first element child of that list item. And that first element child is an image, right? So, you know, if we click inside the list item, then we're going to show and hide that image. Let's see what happens. Yep, there we go. Cool. Finally, how about, so we have this remove button here. Let's attach an event listener to the remove button. And what we're going to do is remove all the selected pets. So anything that's selected, when we click this button, it's going to remove it from the page. Not because we want to delete them from existence, maybe because they just found a home, a lovely new home. Let's say this is an adoption directory, which, hey, it's a little bit more fun than a to-do list, right? And in fact, we're going to get into making this this page a little more interactive and cruddy, if you will. Create, run, delete, create, run. Yeah, whatever crud stands. So yeah, cruddy in an upcoming session too, right? You can create elements, you can read and delete, update and delete. Okay, so back to our code. Let's select that button up top. So we'll do const button. It has the button element. So let's do document query selector button. Yeah. By the way, like when I'm screencasting at Treehouse, all of this gets edited out. So I'm constantly flubbing stuff and making all these weird typos. And we have great editors and production staff that edits all this out from our final video. So thank you. Shout out to you all. Fine folks. Cool. So we have a reference to the button. So now let's attach an event listener to it. So let's go down here to the final comment here. And we'll do button.add event listener. Again, since we're clicking the button, we want to listen for a click event. We'll pass in that event object. And let me backtrack here. All right. So inside, what we're going to do, so when a button gets clicked, then we want to iterate over all the checkboxes to make sure which ones are checked and which ones aren't. If they are checked, if a checkbox is checked, it's going to get removed from the page. So real quick, let's do that. We have a reference to it here with the checkboxes node list. So we'll use the for each iteration method. So for each checkbox, we're going to do something. We'll say if checkbox is checked. So we'll check the checked property. This will return true or false. If it's checked, it'll return true. If not, false. And then we'll say checkbox.parent node. More on that in just a bit. .remove. So many ways you can do this, but this is just one way. Keep in mind. Okay, so we're iterating through each checkbox in the collection, and for each checkbox, if it's checked, we'll remove it for the document. Again, we're doing a little DOM traversal here to reference the checkbox's parent node, which, as you can see, is the list item. And then we're calling the remove method on it, and that's going to remove the element or node from the DOM tree completely. My dog is just as excited as DOM traversal as I am, if you can hear her barking in the background. Okay, so now let's check a few items here. By the way, my dog, if you can hear, that is indeed Joey, the Australian Shepherd. Perfect timing, right on cue, Joey. So let's target Joey, and Joey found a home. So let's remove Joey from the page and bring up DevTools here, and you can see how each list item is indeed being removed from the page. Select all of them, in fact. Cool, there we go. Just a little preview there of deleting elements, which we'll talk more about in our next live stream. All right, any questions? Any questions? Love the doggo theme. Awesome, thank you. Try to do a fine mixture of dogs and cats this time. So that's really all I have for you today. So I hope that you enjoyed learning a little bit more about the wonderful DOM. And in upcoming live streams, we'll talk more about creating elements and dynamically inserting content into the page. Also, we'll talk a little bit more and work with removing elements like you just saw, and working with form elements too. That's fun. Again, you can learn a lot more front-end and full-stack JavaScript-related topics at teamtreehouse.com, and be sure to check out the free trial we have going for you there. I am Guil H on Twitter, if you want to check that out and follow me there. And yeah, to follow up on all upcoming live streams, you can go to our Treehouse live page here at join.teamtreehouse.com. When you sign up for notifications, you will not miss any of our upcoming live streams because you will be notified. In fact, the bottom of the page here has a schedule with all the upcoming topics. Cool. Well, this was fun. This was great. Thanks so much for tuning in. And as always, be safe and well out there, and happy coding. Appreciate it. Thanks, everyone.